This week on Perspective, democracy's challenge, the rise of populism. If there's a common thread through the stories shaping these political times, it's the rise of populism. By some definitions, populism is the idea that society is divided into two groups, the people and the elites, us versus them. To be a populist is often considered an insult. But the world over, populism is on the rise. Consider Trump in the US, Duterte in the Philippines, Erdogan in Turkey, Orbán in Hungary. Primary campaign issue was the threat of migration. International election observers noted the campaign rhetoric was hostile, intimidating, and xenophobic, that media bias and campaign financing undermined the ability of other parties to compete fairly. He has asserted government control in the media and the judiciary. But we're going to begin with a broader look at populism and democracy. Yascha Mounk is a leading expert on the crisis of liberal democracy and the rise of populism. He's a lecturer on government at Harvard University and the host of a podcast called The Good Fight, and the author of The People versus Democracy: Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. It's been well known for some time that people have declining faith in government institutions, in politicians themselves, in journalists. What's surprising to me about some of your work is that it now attaches, that declining faith has attached itself to democracy, the very idea of it. Tell me what your work actually shows.
Well, so as you're saying, for a long time there was this assumption that we can make a neat distinction between what social scientists call government legitimacy and what we call regime legitimacy. So we said, look, yeah, people are getting more and more fed up with particular politicians. Particular governments tend to be more unpopular than they were. Institutions have less confidence and trust in them. But you know what? All of that is fine, because this is just a sign of citizens becoming more demanding, more critical, that they sort of want better service, right? They're still really satisfied with how the political system as a whole is working. And that's always struck me as a slightly implausible distinction in that kind of strength. And so I started to look at some of the data with a colleague, Roberto Faure. And what we found was pretty shocking. Taking the United States as an example, among older people born in the 1930s and 1940s, over 2/3 say it's really important to them to live in a democracy. Among younger people born since 1980, it's less than 1/3. And people are even becoming more open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy. So the number of people, for example, who want a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections, or who are open to as extreme an alternative as army rule, has really gone up in the last decade.
And that's in countries like the United States, which have been long regarded as sort of the bastion of democratic ideals. Do we need to think about democracy differently? You attach, I mean, sort of different, you talk about illiberal democracy and undemocratic liberalism. Help me understand what those mean. Yeah,
so I think, first of all, we need to remember that our political system really has two key components. It's a liberal democracy. Now, liberal doesn't mean liberal conservative. It doesn't mean Trudeau versus Harper. It doesn't mean Obama versus Bush. It means a commitment to ensuring that we as individuals can actually get to lead a free life, that we can say what we want to say or not say, that we can worship in the way we want to worship or not worship, that we can be in a relationship with who we want to be. And all of that requires that there's no tyranny of a majority, right? That we preserve individual minority rights, and that you don't have a dictator who starts to take on more and more power. So we need the separation of powers, and we need the rule of law. The second element is the democratic element. We don't just want to be free, you and I, to do what we want. We also collectively want to be able to rule ourselves, right? So democracy means, in that sense, just the rule of the people, translating popular views into public policies. My fear is that these two things have been falling apart for a long time. That for a long time, our political system hasn't been sufficiently responsive. So we've had a form of rights without democracy, in which we've had the rule of law, we've had the separation of power, we've done a reasonably good job of protecting individual rights, but we haven't actually implemented popular views into public policy. This is one of the reasons for the rise of populists around the world, from Donald Trump in the United States to some like Recep Erdogan in Turkey, who are saying, you know what, the system isn't responsive anyway, the political elites don't care about people like you and me. So just trust me, I'm going to be the voice of the people.
Today's ceremony, however, has very special meaning, because today we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people. For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little to celebrate for struggling families all across our land. Nobody knows the system better than me. Which is why I alone can fix it.
That was certainly Trump's rhetoric. And he's a populist. But what about, put someone like Bernie Sanders in that picture? Because the question I'm driving at, is populism necessarily anti-democratic? It doesn't appear to be.
And what democratic socialism is about is saying that it is immoral and wrong that the top 1/10 of 1% in this country own almost 90%, own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. That it is wrong today in a rigged economy that 57% of all new income is going to the top 1%. That when you look around the world, you see every other major country providing health care to all people as a right, except the United States.
Well, I think the way that I think about populism, it is always quite dangerous because populists claim there's an important distinction between an adversary and an enemy in politics. Mm-hmm. Somebody like John McCain in the United States marked it very nicely in 2008 in the last days of a campaign when he was running against Barack Obama.
I want to be president of the United States, and obviously I do not want Senator Obama to be. But I have to tell you, he is a decent person and a person that you do not have to be scared as president of the United States. Now, I can't
trust Obama. I have read about him, and he's an Arab. He is not. No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about. He's not. Thank you.
He was saying, no, he is an adversary, not an enemy. Populists don't make that distinction. They claim that I alone stand with the people, and everybody who disagrees with me is a kind of traitor.
We are in a rigged system, and a big part of the rigging are these dishonest people in the media.
On that definition, I don't think that Bernie Sanders is a populist. So even though he might have left-wing economic policies he pursues, I don't think that's a reason to call him a populist in the kind of way that I'm talking about.
What is it that's motivating people, I guess, to want to hear that populist message that's, sort of, they're disillusioned on the one hand, but then they have to actually make a choice to follow that populist leader?
So it's a set of things. One of them is this rebellion against a political system that's not responsive enough. But there's deeper drivers of it, right? I mean, people in every local context I go to and study and speak to people to sort of have their own explanations, right? So in the United States, it's, oh, the Republican Party is radicalized for a long time. That's certainly true and seems like a plausible explanation. When you go to Germany, where I grew up, and people say, oh, you know why populism is on the rise? Because Angela Merkel is so centrist, and she's not a true conservative, and so it's leaving this open space on the right of politics. Those two things can't plausibly both be the reason at the same time. So we have to look at things that are in common among a lot of the countries that are going populist. So what are those? Well, it's a stagnation of living standards for average citizens, especially strong in some countries, but even in Canada that has reasonable policies that try to ensure that a lot of the gains from globalization and free trade go to average citizens. From 1950 to 1975 to 1980, the kind of things that an average Canadian could afford really just increased in a very tangible way. For the last 20, 30 years, It's not been the case to nearly the same extent. And so people never loved Ottawa. They never completely trusted politicians. They never said, those are paragons of moral virtue.
Right.
But they said, you know what, they seem to be delivering. In the end, they're sticking to their end of the deal. And now they're saying, hey, I've worked hard all my life. I don't have that much to show for it. My kids might do worse than me. Look at how expensive it is now to rent an apartment and to rent a house in a big city in Canada. So perhaps let's try something new. Right? The second thing is around the difficult transition from a set of mono-ethnic, monocultural countries to multi-ethnic ones. It's especially stark in Europe, where back in 1960 there was a very clear idea that a true German, Swede, Italian was descended from the same ethnic stock, and that somebody who's brown or black or Muslim or Hindu or Jewish certainly doesn't belong. Thankfully, that started to change. There's a lot of people who have something to lose from that, because they got advantages from being part of a majority group and getting to look down on other people. So that's a difficult political transition. In countries like Canada, like the United States, we've always had multi-ethnic societies. We've always had multi-ethnic societies with a steep racial hierarchy. And as we're coming to overcome that, that's something we should celebrate. We've actually made great strides on that, but it shouldn't be surprising that some of the people who held those advantages in the past are saying, hey, I'm afraid of what I'm losing here.
You talk about some solutions to this, about, I mean, your fears around what may happen, but at the same time, some solutions to this. How, I mean, given the political context that we're dealing with now, particularly when we look at the United States, what do you think are the kind of remedies to some of the things that you think could happen if populism is allowed to surge?
So the remedies have to respond to the causes, right? And so we need to make sure that politics becomes more responsive to ordinary people, which involves reducing the role that money plays in politics.
One of the things that you talk about, and David Frum talks about too, is about engaging citizens. And given that most people don't feel that they have a voice, you know, that their vote doesn't necessarily count, how do you do that? How do you go about engaging them when they've already sort of feel left out?
Well, one of the things we have to do is to remind people of what's valuable in our political system. And that's a hard thing to do, because there's lots of things that are wrong in our countries. There are lots of injustices, and we need to be upfront about those, and we need to fight to overcome them. But at the same time, it's undoubtedly better to be a citizen today of Canada, of the United States, of Italy, of Germany, than it is to be a citizen of Turkey or China or Venezuela. And I think reminding people of the values of liberal democracy, of what it means that we do have individual freedom and collective self-rule, even if in limited ways, even if in imperfect ways, is a really important task for education, but we're not taken nearly seriously enough. You know, from Plato to Aristotle and from Machiavelli to Rousseau, all of the great political thinkers of the past realized that a self-governing republic will only survive if you pass our values off from one generation to the next.
It also has to come with some sense of what it is to be a nation or a nation state. Given the threat that people feel from immigration and immigrants who perhaps don't look like them, the notion of a globalized economy, what do you think then would constitute sort of how you would describe to those citizens that you want to engage what it is to be a patriotic American or a patriotic Canadian?
We have to do two things at the same time. The first is to stand up to, frankly, exclusionary conceptions of patriotism and nationalism, racist conceptions of patriotism and nationalism, but increasingly prevalent on the right, to people who say, if you're brown or black, you can't be Canadian. And we need to, without footnote, without limitation, defend people who are being discriminated against. At the same time, you know, I grew up Jewish in Germany, and I come more from the political left, and so I see the temptation on my side of the political spectrum, either to run away from nationalism altogether and say this is dangerous and evil and it's led to so much violence, let's just give up on any need for collective identities, or the temptation to just celebrate subnational forms of identity, whether it's around race, around religion, around gender and sexuality, to the exclusion of other ones. And I think that's a mistake. Look, if there's a big national disaster on the other side of Canada, why do you feel a special call to help? Because you have something in common as Canadians across racial and ethnic and so on lines. And I think that's a powerful thing that we should celebrate. So we need to fight for an inclusive nationalism, an inclusive patriotism.
I also want to ask you about, because you write about the importance of rhetoric. You know, you could say, you know, Trump's rhetoric comes via his Twitter feed. Obama was a great orator and was very good at sort of choosing his words and making people think, I would say.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about why you think the language is so important, particularly now as we look at sort of the whole idea of censorship and even how in universities it's now becoming a critical issue. And this is really, this goes back to what you said about the left, where there's a notion of censorship there.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, rhetoric politically is important because it motivates people. When I look at the 2016 election in the United States, it seems to me that it was a fight between an extremist politics of change and a moderate politics of a status quo. Which is to say that one side of the battle, Donald Trump, had quite a nasty vision of what the future would look like, but it was a vision, right? And the other side said, well, things are already great and, we're not really. It turns out that under those circumstances, people might choose the extremist. So one of the reasons for the importance of rhetoric is that you need to paint a picture of what our common future is and how politics can help bring it about. In the end, if people are deeply pessimistic and cynical, they're always going to go for populists, they're always going to go for authoritarian forms of politics. We need to be able to show people that politics can deliver for them. And it's partially a question of results, it's partially a question of actually making people feel the improvements in their lives, but it's also a question of calling on the better angels in people's nature and setting out a vision of what we can achieve together, while we don't have to be scared of each other and we don't have to be scared of the future. Also
now put that in the context of the sort of push we see often from the left, as you pointed out, to limit freedom of speech on university campuses, to limit our choice of words if that's how we choose to speak.
I certainly am a big believer in freedom of speech, and I think that students should be allowed to protest anybody who comes to speak, but they need to make sure that he can speak. Right? It's absolutely fine to have a protest outside the hall. I think it's fine to have a protest inside the hall for a little moment to show your disavowal of something. But it's important that people should continue to be able to actually make their voices heard and express their opinions, even if they're opinions that we strongly dislike, and even if they're opinions that we have good reason to dislike. There's sometimes this weird thing that happens in debates about freedom of speech, where people think, well, if a particular opinion doesn't have any value, why should we give it a platform? And in a way, I agree. There's some opinions that really don't have any value. Nothing is lost if those opinions aren't expressed. Like lies. Yeah. But here's the important thing. I don't trust anybody to make the decision for me what opinion does or doesn't have value. And that's why I'm a defendant of freedom of speech. Not because all speech is valuable, but because I don't trust a particular government or a particular university administration to make that decision for me, or nor do I trust a group of self-appointed people to do that.
Now we're looking at Facebook, and it's been a big driver of populist movements and used by, sort of mainstream politicians as well. Now that they're talking about regulation, and they are in deep trouble over this breach of people's privacy. Is that going to change some of the political dynamic as well?
I mean, I think it's already changed the political dynamic in the sense that one of the great transformations of the past decades is the fact that we used to have gatekeepers who were quite powerful, right? People who had jobs in public broadcasting corporations or people who owned private media companies. They got to decide whose views were given a platform and whose views weren't given a platform. Well, now through a website, you can basically for free spread your views to the whole world. And through social media, you can reach an audience of millions in a matter of minutes, of hours, if you post something that is of particular interest to people. And so that gatekeeping function has gone away. That can be a very positive thing. It's a positive thing in dictatorships, where it makes it easier for the democratic opposition to point out the corruption and the repression of a dictator. It can even be a good thing in democratic societies, making it easier for marginalized voices to be heard. But obviously it also makes it much easier for people who want to spread hatred, who want to spread lies to have a real platform. Now, I mean, the thing that makes it particularly dangerous in this political moment is not that it's inherently good or bad, it's that it comes on top of all these other frustrations we've talked about. Is that people are already mistrustful of the ability of the institutions to deliver for them. It's that they already are fearful of cultural change. But I don't think it's the role of the state to censor what people can say on Facebook in that way. And it's certainly not the role of the state to punish people for what they say on Facebook in that way. So look, we're not going to be able, in the end, to limit the supply, the offer of obnoxious and horrible ideas in our society. And trying to do that is going to make martyrs out of the populists and not be effective anyway. What we can do is to change the demand for them by actually fighting for our values and by actually making sure that we emphasize the things that are working in our societies as well.
After all of this, and I know this is your continuing work, are you an optimist?
You know, I'm an optimist in one sense. You know, I'm not an optimist in the sense that I can promise you a happy end.
Right.
The rise of populism has been going on for 20 or 30 years. It's happening in many countries around the world. And we've seen that countries that seemed stable, that seemed safe 5 years ago to political scientists, now have a democracy threatened in very acute ways, like Hungary.
Yes.
So I can't promise you a happy end. What I can say is that I find this energizing rather than depressing. Because when I came of age politically, there were big stakes. There were important issues of public policy I cared about. But we sort of knew what our countries would look like 20 or 30 years from now. At least we thought we did. Well, now we recognize that we don't, that what we do really matters. And unlike the citizens of some of the countries that have already fallen prey to dictatorship, we still retain our ability to act politically. We don't have to fear going to prison for speaking our mind, for organizing politically, for pushing establishment parties to do a better job, for opposing populists at the polls. So let's do our duty as citizens to fight for our political values.
Thank you very much.